Hey, what's going on, everybody? We got the all green on, so we can just focus on the sweet stash on this Thursday night theory. Gonna bring it to you so you can understand what the adjusted line play report numbers mean, how I approach these, and just kind of get an idea of how these numbers are generated and how you can use that to build up a particular game script and figure out what players are going to do well in that particular game. Woo! All right, so let's get underway with the Thursday night theory. We've got a really bad game here. It's New England heading into Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh 6-point favorites. We have the Vegas game total all the way down at 30, and I believe earlier this season we had a team that was at 32 and a half or 33, which was the lowest one in like 10 years. This beats it by almost 10% here. 3 less points with that 30 Vegas game total. Typically, when I say they start getting into the low 40s, especially for these island game matchups, you want to start considering the defenses and the kickers in your top 6-player pool, just because there's not going to be a ton of fantasy points to be had by the rest of the positional players. That your defense and kickers are probably going to fall into the top 6 fantasy point scorers on that day. So, or for that particular game for these island game matchups. So keep that in mind as we're going through here. Because of this 30 Vegas game total and the 6-point home favorite, that gives Pittsburgh 18 as a home favorite here. 18 is typically one of the lowest scores that you will see on the main slate. Pittsburgh actually the favorite by 6 points at 18. With that in mind, New England 12 points is what Vegas is saying that they project them to score. So that is how that is going to roll out and be kind of important here as we go through the numbers. So getting into the actual numbers: offensive pass protection, offensive pass DVOA, offensive run blocking, offensive run DVOA. We're going to kind of section it. Pass protection and pass DVOA, and then we'll get into the run game for the away team, and then we'll do it for Pittsburgh. Kind of let you know what each number means, and then once we get into the Pittsburgh one, we can kind of utilize that new knowledge to see how Pittsburgh might play. So first one on the board here, offensive pass protection. We pit it against the defensive pass rush. So what this is adjusted sack rate. If your offense is not getting sacked a ton, either because your offensive line is really good or your quarterback just gets the ball out quickly, the better your number is going to be. So the number one team taking the fewest amount of sacks in general. Defensive pass rush, the better number that is, higher, closer to a number one team, the more pressure and the more sacks that this team is generating. The one thing to note that is important here, this is the adjusted sack rate. So not all sacks are created equal. If you get a sack at the end of the game on 4th and 35 and the team's trying to throw a Hail Mary, in those particular situations, a sack, would be kind of expected. So if you get a sack in that situation, good for your defense, but it's not going to count the same as, let's say it's, first and goal on the 1-yard line and you end up getting a sack in that situation. That's going to count for a lot more of a sack compared to one where it's like 4th and 35 at the end of the game and the quarterback takes a sack in that particular situation. Those sacks aren't created equal. You'd expect the team to run on 1st and goal at the 1. If you're getting a sack in that situation, it's a lot better for your defense, considering what the situation was. So that's the adjusted sack rate. Same thing goes for the offensive side. If you're taking sacks in pretty common situations and you are the exact same amount of sacks taken as another team on a per game basis, is going to start taking that adjusted factor into account. So if you're getting sacked on, 2nd and 5 quite often versus somebody else who's maybe got the same amount of sacks, but they're taking them on 3rd and 12, 3rd and long, things like that, those aren't created equal. You'd expect to get some sacks in those scenarios, and the ones with the less common scenarios are going to have a worse rating here. So that's the offensive protection, defensive pass rush pit against each other. That's the adjusted sack rate. What's going on in this situation? Well, they're both number 9 here, both top 10 in that category. Part of the thing for New England is that they're getting the ball out quick. If you look at their pace of play on offense, it's pretty much all in the green, or has been all season. So that top 10 matchup for them, they're just not taking a ton of sacks because I think they're getting the ball out quick. That's how their offense is designed to operate, is just get the ball out of the hands as soon as possible. So they're not taking a ton of sacks in general, but really that's kind of what this is saying is New England's a top 10 unit in terms of taking sacks on the field. Pittsburgh, on the other hand, their defense is also top 10 at number 9. So they're a top 10 unit on defense in terms of getting after the quarterback, getting sacks there. So generally what I say, hey, I know New England maybe in the top 10 here, but they're probably going to be under a little bit more pressure than they're used to because this defensive unit is a top 10 unit, and perhaps they're getting the ball out quick, but it could be under a little bit more duress because this defense is really coming after them, top 10 unit. That's typically what I'll say, as well as when it's close like this, studs eat kind of a scenario where the offensive line and defensive line is almost kind of like a stalemate. You can consider it a neutral situation, and then if you have somebody who's super good, they can overcome these neutral situations just because they're going to be better than the players on defense trying to tackle them or whatever the case may be. But really that's how I'm looking at this. Adjusted sack rate, they're dead even. Really looking at New England to have a little bit more pressure than they're perhaps used to, but Pittsburgh maybe not getting as many sacks as you would hope because New England, I think, does get the ball out quickly. Now, taking into consideration Vegas game total at 30, these might come into a little bit more consideration if your defenses could be in the top 6 scoring entities on an island game. Anyway, that's the adjusted sack rate. Getting into the offensive pass DVOA, so looking at adjusted sack rate, but the offensive pass DVOA, how is New England top 10 here, but a bottom 3 team or bottom 4 team in the pass DVO? What's going on here? It looks like they have really good offensive line, but their pass DVO is really bad. So DVOA in general, it stands for defensive value over average, really taking into account the adjusted play based off of the defenses that they were facing. So it's defensive adjusted value over average. Really looking at historical averages in terms of, hey, based on this particular situation, let's say it is third quarter, your team is up by 10 and you're on the opponent's 35-yard line, and it's 2nd and 8 in a particular situation like that. There's 6 minutes left in the third quarter. In those situations when somebody passes, you're up 10, you're in the opponent's X yard line, the score is within X amount, and you decide to pass on this particular down and distance. In those particular scenarios throughout history, what is an average outcome for that play? And then it looks at that versus the defense that you're playing and how good they are and what the outcome was for your particular play. So let's say you have super dominant defense, just to give an example, a super dominant defense, maybe it's the early 2000s Ravens. They're really shutting people down. In this particular situation, 2nd and 8, when there's a pass play, the typical yardage gained is maybe 6 yards on a pass play. Let's just say that's the average typical play. If you get 6 yards on an average typical play, hey, you met the threshold, but it also takes into account the defense that you're playing. So this 2000s Ravens defense, they're like historically good, right? They're normally shutting people down in those situations. It's going to take that into account and say, hey, I know this was historically the exact same as what normally happens, but it happened against a really good defense, so it's going to look a little bit better than somebody that did the exact same thing against a historically bad defense in the same situation. So defense adjusted value over average. So how how did that particular play in that particular scenario perform versus the average in the same exact situation, and then adjusting it for the defense that you're playing. So that's really what the DVOA is standing for both offensive pass DVOA and the offensive run DVOA. So when we get to run, keep in mind that's the exact same kind of concept, but just taking the pass game and switching it to the run game. So New England 29th. They're kind of historically terrible, or they've been really bad compared to historical averages for the typical outcomes when passing. So really what this tells me is New England's been struggling to move the ball on offense via the pass game. Doesn't really matter what defense they're facing. They're one of the worst offensive units in that regard. Now getting into the Pittsburgh defense, they're top 6, so number 6 overall in the defensive pass DVOA. This is telling me that they've really kind of been shutting teams down in terms of their pass game, making them very ineffective or inefficient when they choose to pass the ball. They're kind of not getting a very good result in general. So this tells me, hey, even though New England gets the ball out quick, Pittsburgh's defense probably going to be applying a little bit pressure compared to what they're used to. And then this 29 versus 6, that's a red versus green matchup. Those are the ones that we always kind of pay attention to because that really is one of those outlier outcomes where, hey, now we're looking at New England really, really, really struggling in the pass game. They're probably not going to move the ball very well at all. So, in an island game situation, this is one where I'm probably going to be avoiding this pass game in general, where you maybe only want one particular player on this, and maybe it's the running back that's getting some short dump offs if the run game looks to be a little bit better. But really, that's the offensive pass DVOA and defensive pass DVOA in those particular situations and kind of what those numbers mean. So when you go through and look at the offensive pass protection and that adjusted sack rate, and then looking at the defensive adjusted value over average and how they've performed compared to the rest of the league this season, that's what those numbers are. So getting into the run blocking, this one's a little bit different. It's an adjusted line play rate. So basically how good has each run play been? Similar to the pass protection, it's an adjusted sack rate. This is an adjusted rate for how good the run game has been. So if you're getting hit behind the line of scrimmage, tackled behind the line of scrimmage as a running back, that's going to be really bad for your offensive run blocking unit. That's not really on the running back, correct? Hey, you got hit 3 yards behind the line of scrimmage and tackled. That's more on the offensive line. They didn't perform very well in that particular play. That's going to count for really bad in terms of the offensive run blocking. If you're getting stuffed right at the line of scrimmage, same deal, but not as bad as getting hit behind the line of scrimmage or a negative play. And then kind of as you kind of progress through those things, 1 to 3 yard gain, hey, that's kind of a little bit below what you'd expect on a typical run, depending on the situation, right? But just looking at, hey, 1 to 3 yards, it wasn't negative. We didn't get any yards, but hey, we gained a little bit of positive yards. Offensive line did all right, but it could have done a little bit better. And when you start getting like, hey, when it's a 4 to 6 yard gain, this is really kind of what we're hoping for. This is, if the offensive line performs all its blocks and the running back, follows the blocks, we'd expect about a 4 to 6 yard gain on any standard run, somewhere in that situation. And then like a 6 to 10 yard run is going to be viewed a little bit differently from those. That's really good. Hey, your offensive line obviously did a lot of really good work. Kind of got to the next level, got you into the 6 to 10 yard range for that particular outcome, and then anything 10 plus. So I think those are where they're looking at. How did those, come about, and how good was your offensive line unit kind of in that context in terms of behind the line of scrimmage, at the line of scrimmage, like 1 to 3 yards, 4 to 6 yards, 7 to 10 yards, or 10 plus. So kind of keeping that idea, like consistently good, consistently bad, something like that. New England's offensive run blocking, number 12, so they're a top 12 unit. Pittsburgh below average there at number 20. So this is really telling me, in general, on a run-to-run basis, New England's going to be a little bit better than Pittsburgh's defense in that run game. They should be gaining positive yardage for the most part in most of their running situations. And then getting into the run DVOA, again, this is similar to that pass DVOA compared to historical averages. in that particular situation, how did you perform? And taking into account how good that defense was, New England sitting at number 18, so slightly below average. Pittsburgh at 15, so right at the average amount. Really what this is telling me, especially in an island game setting, I'm probably going to look at the New England run game. Pass game looks to be terrible. They're probably going to have to get the ball out a little bit quicker. Going to be under a little bit of pressure, so they're going to be dumping the ball off a little bit more. We do have the Ramondre Stevenson injury, so it should just be the Zeke show in New England there, so keep that in mind. I think they also have Harris there, who's probably going to be backing him up, who could be a really, really cheap option there in New England for an island game if you're looking to kind of stack the Pittsburgh side with a little bit more expensive options. So New England, I'm basically looking at Zeke or Harris there and trying to avoid the rest of the pass game unless it's maybe a tight end like Hunter Henry, who maybe gets 5 or 6 targets, catches 5 or 6 of them on a DK setting where that's a point per reception. But really, outside of the run game, we'll get into the defense. Maybe New England's defense with this Vegas game total could be in play too, but it's avoiding that pass game, looking at the run game for New England's actual offense. So with that in mind, let's get into that home team. How is Pittsburgh going to perform in this particular matchup? Well, getting into that adjusted sack rate, Pittsburgh's offensive pass protection number 7, New England 29th in the defensive pass rush. This is telling me that even though, hey, Pittsburgh green, even if that's, them getting the ball out quick, not taking sacks, New England's defense is really bad at getting after the quarterback and generating sacks. Pittsburgh probably going to have plenty of time to throw the ball, which is going to be good for their offense in general, to have time to throw the ball. The deep threat, not necessarily Deontay Johnson there. It's more of the Pickens show. They do have some speedy other receivers there that you can look into in DFS if you're interested in getting a little bit unique in a tournament setting. But really, I'd be just kind of looking at this and saying Pittsburgh's going to have a ton of time to throw. It's going to be good for Trubisky. Wouldn't expect him to necessarily have to be flushed out of the pocket very often, but really looking at those first and second read options on Pittsburgh's offense, probably going to have time to stand back there and wait for them to get open or, go through their routes without having to get too much pressure. So that's how I'm looking at that. The defensive pass DVOA is a little bit quicker, closer. Pittsburgh at number 20, New England at 23. So this is telling me, hey, it's not, it's pretty even matchup in terms of how they typically perform. With that in mind, New England is red. Pittsburgh probably going to find it a little bit easier than they've found throughout the rest of the season to move the ball via the air. So that's what this is telling me. They're going to have plenty of time to throw. They're going to be able to move the ball a little bit better than they're used to against this New England defense in the pass game. So pass game certainly in play here for Pittsburgh. Getting into the run side, Pittsburgh number 7 in offensive run blocking, New England number 9 in stopping the run. This is telling me, hey, Pittsburgh, they've been pretty effective running the ball. They might find it a little bit more difficult against this top 10 unit in New England. But in general, especially when these are close matchups like this, I say studs eat. I don't necessarily think Pittsburgh has a stud in Najee Harris. He's certainly fine in his outright. I would say if you're looking for somebody that's a little bit more explosive, Jaylen Warren is actually probably, is he the more talented back? I would say a lot of people would say yes in that particular category, so he might be able to overcome this. But I'm just saying, if you had somebody, back in the day, Adrian Peterson, and it's a matchup like this, hey, he can overcome that. He's just better than the other people, than the people on the other side of the ball. He doesn't necessarily matter, or the offensive line with a neutral matchup like that, he's going to be able to dominate those defenders if those, linemen are doing their job, just picking up the standard blocks. I don't think Pittsburgh necessarily has anybody like that on their team, but just keep in mind they're probably going to find it a little bit more difficult to run the ball against this New England defense, but they might be up depending on how this game script goes. Getting into the offensive run DVOA, Pittsburgh number 9, New England number 2 in the defensive run DVOA. And really what this is telling me, slightly in the favor here of New England, but really, New England been really, really good against the run. They're a top 2 unit here in general, even though Pittsburgh's a top 10 unit. They're probably going to find it a little bit more difficult to run the ball in this matchup. on Thursday night, even though they might want to. It's looking to me more like this pass game is going to be a little bit more friendly to them. So, while I don't think it's absolutely egregious to grab, Harris or Jaylen Warren for your DFS matchups and your Island game matchups, I'm probably going to be for sure looking at the Pittsburgh pass game to make sure I at least get one or two options of those on my squads as I go through. Now, one last thing, we do have pace of play on the bottom here, really looking at the offensive pace of play. Defensive pace of play, not necessarily as indicative. That kind of is more based off of game script. But really, New England offensive overall pace of play is number 4. So just taking how many plays they run per second, or how many seconds per play that they run, they are 4th in the league. They're number 6 in offensive neutral situations. So those are situations not including like the last 2 minutes of the second half and not including the fourth quarter. So anytime in the first, second, or third quarter, that's not the last 2 minutes. In a situation where the game total was within one score, really that's what that's looking at. Offensive neutral situation pace of play, they're a top 6 unit. So when the game situation doesn't necessarily dictate that you should be playing faster or slower, they are number 6 in the league. When they're leading, New England at number 4, so 4th best team when they're leading by 7 or more points. When the game is close, within 6 points, they're top 10. And then when they're trailing by 7+, it's number 12. So really, when you're trailing a little bit, we see in general most NFL teams play a little bit faster. New England looking like, hey, just based off of this, they might just be in general the exact same pace no matter what the situation is. Even when they're trailing, they're running basically as fast as they normally do, but it's probably going to be a little bit slower than other teams when they're trailing, kind of pick up that pace. Same thing for Pittsburgh. So their overall pace of play, number 18. In those neutral situations, they're a top 12 unit. When they're leading by 7+, they're one of the slowest teams in the league, which is 31. So probably looking at that aspect, considering New England doesn't look like they're going to score any points here. Pittsburgh on their offensive pace of play in those games where it's within 6 points, they are 23rd, and then when they're trailing by 7+, they're 17th fastest pace of play team. So they're kind of slow. New England very fast here. Just looking at Island game matchup with this Vegas game total, New England kicker, if we think New England can get within field goal range once or twice, probably going to be one of the best individual units for the New England offense as well, outside of that running back game. So if the running game can get them within field goal range, I just don't see the offense being able to punch in any touchdowns in this particular matchup. So if you want to place any sort of bets on New England not scoring a touchdown in this game on offense, be my guest. I think that's a pretty safe bet in this matchup. Either way, Pittsburgh should be pretty decent on offense here. It's not like a great matchup. They should have plenty of time to throw the ball and find it a little bit easier in the pass game than they're perhaps used to, but they do have Trubisky in there, and we've seen this offense struggle throughout the entire season. Even with Matt Canada gone, it's not necessarily been super great. And then it looks like the run game is going to struggle a little bit more. So Pittsburgh kicker certainly in place, same as New England kicker. But yeah, it's kind of an interesting little matchup here with a 30-point Vegas game total. Hopefully you learned a little bit about what these numbers mean. Offensive pass protection, defensive run stopping. What do these numbers mean? How can I utilize them to make my decisions better in my start-sit decisions, in my seasonal long leagues, in my DFS? Some of these prop bets you can get really good plays out of. Hey, this is looking like a really bad matchup for them. I'm betting the under, whatever the case may be. Kind of utilizing this info to build a game script in your head about what's going to happen, and then applying that to, win some money in your fantasy football leagues, in your DFS tournaments, and maybe in the prop bet industry as well. So hopefully you learned a little bit. I'm going to get going. Thanks for watching this ugly mustache and this kind of floating head in general. Talk to you about the adjusted line player report. Really appreciate it. Have a good one, everybody, and try not to make your eyes bleed on this terrible Thursday night football game tonight. Bye.